The death of Queen Elizabeth I, on March 24, 1603, marked the end of one of England's most extraordinary reigns, yet it also began one of history's most enduring mysteries. In her final hours, the Virgin Queen steadfastly refused to allow physicians to conduct a post-mortem examination of her body, decision that would leave generations of historians, medical experts, and royal biographers grappling with unanswered questions. What killed the woman who had survived assassination plots, foreign invasions, religious upheaval, and the treacherous politics of Tudor England for 45 remarkable years? While the exact cause of Elizabeth's death may never be definitively established, a careful examination of her life, habits, and the toxic beauty practices of the Elizabethan era reveals a deeply troubling possibility that the very cosmetics she used to maintain her legendary appearance may have slowly and systematically poisoned her over the course of decades. The rise of the Virgin Queen. To understand the tragedy of Elizabeth's final years, we must first appreciate the magnitude of what she achieved. Born on September 7, 1533, Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, a union that had split England from Rome and forever altered the course of European history. When Elizabeth was barely 2 years old, her father ordered her mother's execution on charges of adultery, treason, and incest, charges that modern historians largely regard as fabricated. This traumatic beginning would shape Elizabeth's character, making her fiercely independent, deeply suspicious of marriage, and acutely aware of the precarious nature of royal power. Elizabeth's path to the throne was neither direct nor assured. Following Henry VIII's death in 1547, the crown passed first to her younger half-brother, Edward VI, who died of tuberculosis in 1553 at the age of just 15. The throne then went to her elder half-sister, Mary I, whose 5-year reign was marked by her violent persecution of Protestants, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary, and her desperate but unsuccessful attempts to restore Catholic rule to England. Mary's death in 1558, possibly from ovarian cancer or uterine cancer, finally cleared the way for Elizabeth's ascension. Age 25. Elizabeth inherited a nation torn apart by religious conflict, economic instability, and foreign threats. England was a relatively minor power, overshadowed by the mighty Spanish Empire and the French monarchy. The treasury was depleted. The military was weak, and many of her subjects questioned whether a young, unmarried woman could effectively rule. Yet over the next 4.5 decades, Elizabeth would transform England into a formidable naval power, defeat the seemingly invincible Spanish Armada, foster an unprecedented flowering of English culture, including the works of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser, and establish the foundations for what would eventually become the British Empire. The cult of beauty and youth central to Elizabeth's political success was her masterful manipulation of her own image. In an age when monarchs were expected to embody divine perfection, physical appearance was not merely a matter of personal vanity, it was a crucial component of political power. Elizabeth understood this better than perhaps any ruler of her era, and she cultivated an elaborate public persona that emphasized her youth, beauty, and almost supernatural purity. The Queen's famous refusal to marry became not just a political strategy, but a cornerstone of her mystique. While she entertained numerous suitors, including Philip II of Spain, Eric XIV of Sweden, Archduke Charles of Austria, and most notably, Francis, Duke of Anjou, brother to Henry III of France, she ultimately remained single, claiming to be married only to England itself. This Virgin Queen identity allowed her to maintain diplomatic flexibility while positioning herself as an almost saintly figure, untainted by the earthly concerns of marriage and motherhood. But maintaining this image of eternal youth and beauty required increasingly desperate measures as the years passed. Elizabeth was acutely conscious of every sign of aging, every wrinkle, every gray hair. She banned mirrors from her presence in her later years and flew into rages when courtiers made even subtle references to her advancing age. Her obsession with appearing young and beautiful would ultimately drive her to embrace cosmetic practices that, unbeknownst to her, were slowly destroying her health. The smallpox crisis of 1562. The turning point in Elizabeth's relationship with cosmetics came in October 1562, when she contracted smallpox at the age of 29. This disease, caused by the variola virus, was one of the most feared killers of the 16th century, claiming roughly 30% of those it infected and leaving survivors permanently disfigured with deep-pitted scars. The Queen's illness sent shockwaves through the court and the kingdom, not only because her death would have thrown England into a succession crisis, but because smallpox was known to destroy the beauty of even its survivors. For several days, Elizabeth lay close to death, her fever raging, and her body covered in the characteristic pustules of the disease. Her closest advisors, including William Cecil and Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, prepared for the worst, quietly discussing potential successors and the possibility of civil war. The Queen herself, in her delirium, reportedly nominated Robert Dudley as Lord Protector of England, a choice that would have been both politically disastrous and personally revealing of her feelings. For the man she could never marry, miraculously, Elizabeth survived, but the disease left its permanent mark. Her once flawless complexion, which had been praised by ambassadors and poets alike, was now marred by numerous pitted scars across her face and neck. For a woman whose power depended so heavily on her image of divine perfection, this disfigurement was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe how the Queen would spend hours examining her scarred face in private, weeping over the damage that no amount of prayer or royal privilege could undo. It was at this point that Elizabeth began her fateful relationship with Venetian ceruse, the deadly white makeup that would define her appearance for the rest of her life, and quite possibly contribute to her death. The deadly art of Venetian ceruse, also known as spirits of Saturn or simply white lead, was the cosmetic foundation of choice for wealthy European women in the 16th and 17th centuries. This paste, made by combining white lead with vinegar and sometimes other substances like egg whites or crushed pearls, created an almost porcelain-like finish that could completely mask scars, blemishes, and signs of aging. For Elizabeth, still reeling from the psychological and physical damage of smallpox, it seemed like a miraculous solution. The application process was elaborate and time-consuming. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting would first cleanse her skin, then apply the thick white paste in multiple layers, building up what contemporary observers described as a mask-like coating that could be nearly an inch thick by the end of her life. The Queen reportedly had this makeup applied only once a week, leaving it on continuously for days at a time, a practice that maximized the amount of lead that could be absorbed through her skin. What Elizabeth and her contemporaries didn't understand was that lead is a cumulative poison. Unlike some toxins that are quickly processed and eliminated by the body, lead accumulates in bones, teeth, and soft tissues over time, gradually reaching levels that can cause severe neurological and physical damage. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include fatigue, irritability, memory loss, mood swings, muscle weakness, anemia, reproductive problems, and eventually, organ failure and death. Modern medical experts who have studied Elizabeth's documented symptoms and behaviors have noted several troubling parallels to lead poisoning. In her later years, she suffered from memory lapses, severe mood swings, bouts of depression, and what her contemporaries described as melancholy madness. Her famous temper, always formidable, became increasingly unpredictable and violent. She would fly into rages over minor slights, only to fall into periods of profound sadness and withdrawal. The Mercury connection, as if the lead in her foundation weren't dangerous enough. Elizabeth's beauty regimen included several other toxic substances that compounded the damage. When she did remove her makeup, a process that occurred only weekly, she reportedly used a mixture that included mercury, crushed eggshells, and a lump. Mercury, like lead, is a cumulative poison that particularly affects the nervous system. The symptoms of mercury poisoning, known in Elizabeth's time as Mad Hatter's disease from the mercury used in hat making, include tremors, mood swings, irritability, depression, memory loss, and cognitive decline. In severe cases, mercury poisoning can cause personality changes, so dramatic that the victim becomes virtually unrecognizable to those who knew them before. Several of Elizabeth's documented behaviors in her final years aligned disturbingly well with mercury poisoning symptoms. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that enemies were plotting against her even when no evidence supported these fears. Her famous wit and intelligence, which had dazzled European diplomats for decades, began to fail her. She would repeat herself in conversations, forget important state business, and sometimes lapse into incoherent rambling. The blood-red lips of death. Elizabeth's pursuit of the perfect appearance extended beyond her white foundation to her lips, which she painted with a vivid red cosmetic made from cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury sulfide. This substance, while creating a striking blood-red color that became one of Elizabeth's signature features, was extremely toxic. Cinnabar was so dangerous that even the ancient Romans, who were not particularly concerned with worker safety, recognized its deadly properties and typically sentenced only criminals to work in cinnabar mines. In Tudor England, however, the cosmetic use of cinnabar was not only accepted but considered fashionable and even magical. Many believed that red lipstick could ward off death and disease. Tragically ironic belief given the toxic nature of the substance. Elizabeth, increasingly superstitious in her later years, began applying ever thicker layers of this deadly cosmetic, apparently believing it would protect her from illness and help her maintain her grip on life and power. By the time of her death, court observers reported that Elizabeth's lips were coated with nearly half an inch of the crimson paste. The constant application and ingestion of this mercury-based cosmetic would have provided a steady stream of poison directly into her bloodstream, potentially causing or accelerating many of the health problems that plagued her final years. Psychological toll. While the physical effects of Elizabeth's toxic beauty regimen were severe, the psychological impact of her obsession with appearance may have been equally damaging. As she aged, the gap between her public image and her private reality became increasingly difficult to maintain. She banned mirrors from her presence and demanded that only flattering portraits be created and displayed. Anyone who dared to comment on her aging appearance risked imprisonment or exile from court. This desperate attempt to stop time itself created a surreal atmosphere at court, where everyone pretended that the elderly queen was still the young beauty of decades past. Ambassadors wrote privately to their governments about the shocking contrast between Elizabeth's public image and her actual appearance, describing a woman so heavily made up that she looked more like a painted statue than a living person. The psychological strain of maintaining this impossible illusion, combined with the neurological effects of chronic heavy metal poisoning, may have contributed to the severe depression that characterized Elizabeth's final years. She became increasingly isolated, trusting fewer and fewer people, and haunted by the ghosts of her past decisions. The final tragedies of Elizabeth's last years were marked by a series of personal losses that shattered what remained of her emotional equilibrium. The death of her longtime friend and lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, not to be confused with Henry VIII's fifth wife of the same name, in 1598, left her bereft of one of her few remaining confidants. Even more devastating was the fate of Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, who had been like a son to her. Essex, the stepson of her great love, Robert Dudley, had been Elizabeth's favorite courtier for years. Handsome, charismatic, and ambitious, he reminded the aging queen of her younger self and the courtiers who had once competed for her attention. However, Essex's reckless ambition eventually led him to attempt a coup against Elizabeth's government. In 1601, faced with unmistakable evidence of treason, Elizabeth was forced to order the execution of the young man she had loved almost as a son. The psychological impact of Essex's execution was catastrophic for Elizabeth. According to Sir Robert Carey, one of her closest advisors, she never recovered from the guilt and grief of having to order his death. She spent her final years tormented by regret, frequently weeping and expressing her anguish over the necessity of executing someone she had cared for so deeply. The mysterious final days as March 1603 arrived. Elizabeth's health entered its final decline. She had been suffering from what her physicians described as a heavy cold for several weeks, but her condition was clearly more serious than a simple respiratory infection. Modern medical historians have suggested that she may have suffered from pneumonia, cancer, or even a stroke, but the exact nature of her final illness remains unknown. What is known is that Elizabeth's behavior in her last days was deeply disturbing. To those around her, she became convinced that lying down would hasten her death, and she insisted on remaining standing for hours at a time, sometimes as long as 15 hours. Her attendants were forced to surround her with cushions to catch her if she fell, creating a bizarre and heartbreaking scene of a once mighty queen literally refusing to rest even as her body shut down. Elizabeth Sitwell, one of her ladies, later reported several strange incidents from the Queen's final days. According to Sitwell, Elizabeth was tormented by visions and claimed to see the ghostly image of her own body, thin and fearful, in her chamber. Even more mysteriously, Southwell reported that a playing card depicting a queen pierced through the head with a nail was found on Elizabeth's chair, an ominous discovery that was interpreted by many as a supernatural warning of impending death. The embedded ring and final surgery, perhaps the most poignant symbol of Elizabeth's tragic end, was the fate of her coronation ring. For 44 years, this ring had never left her finger, serving as both a symbol of her marriage to England and a physical reminder of her royal authority. Over the decades, however, the ring had gradually embedded itself into her flesh as her fingers swelled with age and possibly the effects of chronic heavy metal poisoning. In her final days, Elizabeth's physicians became deeply concerned about the ring, which had cut so deeply into her finger that it was causing infection and severe pain. They urged her to allow them to surgically remove it, warning that the infection could spread throughout her body if left untreated. Elizabeth, however, was terrified that removing the ring would somehow break her connection to the throne and hasten her death. The proposed surgery was scheduled for March 25, 1603, but Elizabeth never lived to see it. She died on March 24, taking with her to the grave the ring that had become so much a part of her that it could no longer be separated from her flesh, a fitting metaphor for a woman who had so completely merged her identity with her royal role that she could not imagine existing without it. The mysterious aftermath, the circumstances surrounding Elizabeth's death became even more mysterious in the days following her passing. Elizabeth Southwell, the same lady-in-waiting who had reported the strange visions and the pierced playing card, made an extraordinary claim about the Queen's corpse. According to Southwell, Elizabeth's body, sealed in its lead coffin according to royal custom, became so bloated with noxious vapors that the coffin actually exploded. While this account has been treated with skepticism by most historians, it's worth noting that such a phenomenon could theoretically occur if the body contained high levels of toxic metals that continued to generate gases after death. However, Southwell's credibility has been questioned due to her conversion to Catholicism after Elizabeth's death, a religion that the Protestant queen had persecuted throughout her reign. Some historians suggest that Southwell may have invented or exaggerated these disturbing details as a form of posthumous revenge against her former mistress. The scientific verdict. Modern medical and forensic experts who have studied the available evidence about Elizabeth's life and death have reached a sobering conclusion. It is highly likely that the cosmetics she used for over 40 years contributed significantly to her declining health and possibly her death. The combination of lead from her face paint, mercury from her makeup remover and lipstick, and other toxic substances would have created a perfect storm of chronic heavy metal poisoning. Dr. Stephanie Haney, a toxicologist who has studied historical cases of cosmetic poisoning, notes that Elizabeth's documented symptoms: memory loss, mood swings, depression, physical weakness, and eventual organ failure, entirely consistent with decades of exposure to lead and mercury. What we're looking at, Dr. Haney explains, is essentially a 40-year slow-motion poisoning. The queen was literally painting herself to death, one layer at a time. The irony is devastating. In her desperate attempt to preserve her beauty and maintain her power, Elizabeth may have destroyed both. The very substances she trusted to keep her looking young and vibrant were steadily undermining her health and, quite possibly, shortening her life. Legacy of a tragic queen. Despite the tragic circumstances of her final years, Elizabeth I's legacy remains one of the most remarkable in English history. Her 45-year reign, known as the Elizabethan Age, saw England transform from a weak, divided nation into a major European power. She successfully defended England against the Spanish Armada in 1588, established England as a significant naval force, and presided over a golden age of English culture that produced some of the greatest literature, theater, and music in the nation's history. Elizabeth's political acumen was legendary. She successfully played European powers against each other, maintained England's independence in an age of aggressive Catholic expansion, and somehow managed to rule effectively as an unmarried woman, in a world that believed women were inherently unfit for political power. Her famous speech to the troops at Tilbury before the expected Spanish invasion, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," remains one of the most stirring examples of royal oratory in English history. Yet the story of Elizabeth's toxic beauty regimen serves as a powerful reminder of the impossible standards and dangerous practices that women, even the most powerful women in history, have subjected themselves to in pursuit of an idealized appearance. Elizabeth's tragedy was not just personal but cultural, reflection of a society that valued women's beauty above their health, and demanded that they maintain impossible standards of perfection regardless of the cost. Conclusion: the price of perfection. Queen Elizabeth I died as she had lived on her own terms, shrouded in mystery and surrounded by the elaborate rituals and symbols that had defined her extraordinary reign. But her death also marked the end of a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of a society's obsession with female beauty and youth. The lead and mercury that Elizabeth applied to her face day after day, week after week, year after year, served as a kind of slow-acting poison that may have gradually destroyed her health while she pursued an impossible ideal of eternal beauty. Her story reminds us that the pressure to maintain a perfect appearance has claimed victims at the highest levels of society, and that the true cost of beauty is sometimes measured not in gold or vanity, but in years of life itself. In her final moments, Elizabeth I may have understood this tragic irony. Surrounded by the toxic cosmetics that had defined her image for decades, she passed away on March 24, 1603, leaving behind a kingdom transformed, a legend that would endure for centuries, and a mystery that continues to fascinate historians and medical experts more than 400 years after her death. The Virgin Queen's reign had ended, but the questions surrounding her death and the dangerous beauty practices that may have contributed to it remain as compelling and troubling today as they were when she first refused to allow a post-mortem examination of her body. Perhaps that refusal was Elizabeth's final act of vanity, or perhaps it was her last attempt to control her own narrative. Either way, it ensured that the true story of her death would remain forever tantalizingly out of reach, adding one final mystery to the life of England's most enigmatic monarch.